Frankenstein is not about science. It's about responsibility. I'll repeat that. Frankenstein is not about science. It's about responsibility. Chances are your greatest familiarity with Mary Shelley's groundbreaking Gothic masterpiece is by cultural osmosis, whether through parody, homage, or consumerism. Or maybe you grew up with the 1931 Universal Studios film adaptation of Frankenstein and its masterful sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, which are the origin of Boris Karloff's seminal take on the iconic monster. Written and directed by James Whale, an openly gay filmmaker, those first two Universal pictures made the maligned and misunderstood creature a cultural touchstone for the outsider, the other, the oppressed.
Have you never wanted to do anything that was dangerous?
With the industrial horrors of World War I still a recent painful memory, and with mechanized Holocaust looming on the historical horizon, Dr. Frankenstein himself became a symbol of interwar dark science, of humankind's reach exceeding its grasp to ruinous consequences, of curiosity killing the cat. But Shelley's novel germinated in a very different intellectual milieu and touches on very different themes than its 20th century retellings. The daughter of William Godwin, a celebrated Enlightenment philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the English-speaking world's first feminist author, Mary Shelley came of age in the wee decades of the 19th century, a time of intense change. Colonial looting brought immense quantities of raw materials back into Europe, which were processed and commodified in mechanized factories. Technological innovation and exponential growth in production led to rapid urbanization as the birth rate exploded, and agricultural workers migrated by the hundreds of thousands out of the countryside and into the cities, where they sold their labor for a wage. People weren't just working differently, they were thinking differently. Enlightenment rationalism was arguably a more seismic shift even than industrialization. The school of thought known as natural philosophy shed its juvenile occult trappings and matured into what we now call the scientific method, a process which promised to purge the world of the gods and monsters that had haunted the human psyche from time immemorial. It was one of the most consequential periods in history. European civilization had stitched together colonialism, capitalism, and materialism, and created, with a spark of life, the modern world. But every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and drastic societal change inspires fierce countercultural resistance. In Britain, the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, a generation of young bohemians refused to accept this new paradigm, and their defiance turned them into rock stars. Among them were poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, George Gordon Byron, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, passionate and sensitive young mythmakers who lived fast and died young. Today we call these men the Romantics. In the summer of 1814, a 16-year-old Mary Shelley, then Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, befriended the 21-year-old Percy Shelley. Percy, an idle-rich aristocrat and political activist, had been expelled from Oxford for co-authoring a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, at a time when denying the existence of God could result in criminal prosecution. Charmed by William Godwin's radical Jacobin writings, he first entered into an extended correspondence with Mary's father, then a paid mentorship with him. For her part, Mary had been inured to radical politics from a young age, due to the influence of her father and memory of her mother, who had died giving birth to her. And in Percy, she found a kindred spirit. On June 26th, during a visit to the tomb of Mary's mother, she and Percy declared, and probably consummated, their love for one another. On July 28th, the young couple ran away together with Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont on a tour of the continent, where they embarked on a lifestyle that's avant-garde even by today's standards. Like her parents, Mary regarded marriage as a form of ownership, which was just as well, since Percy was still technically married to his estranged first wife. Bucking societal convention, they embraced the free love philosophy of the French revolutionaries and lived polyamorously. In one poem, Percy wrote that, quote, "True love in this differs from gold and clay, that to divide is not to take away. Narrow the heart that loves, the brain that contemplates, the life that wears, the spirit that creates one object and one form, and builds thereby a sepulchre for its eternity." Percy's poetry had also given voice to the various labor movements which were springing up in England's rapidly industrializing cities. Starting in 1811, workers calling themselves the Luddites began smashing and sabotaging the automated textile equipment which factory owners were introducing to replace their jobs. In 1813, Percy published the fantastical poem Queen Mab, which lambasted, quote, those gilded flies that, basking in the sunshine of the court, fatten on its corruption. What are they? The drones of the community. They feed on the mechanic's labor. Later, in 1819, after a cavalry regiment charged a crowd of protesters in Manchester and killed 18 of them, Shelley urged workers to, quote, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep have fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. And striking workers weren't the only flesh that upper-class Britons were chewing through. As the kingdom grew more populous and affluent, animal agriculture became more mechanized and efficient. Throughout the early modern period, most of Britain's population had subsisted on dairy and cereal grains. By 1802, the nation led the world in meat consumption, and the middle and upper classes ate 147 pounds of flesh per person per year. Horrified by the increasingly cruel treatment of farmed animals, Percy adopted a vegetarian diet in 1812, to the scorn of many of his posh friends. In 1813, he published A Vindication of a Natural Diet, which extolled the virtues of ethical vegetarianism and argued that animal domestication was an affront to nature. Mary later adopted these views and became vegetarian herself, as far as we know, for the rest of her life. Percy also advocated for abstinence from alcohol in that essay, while at the same time he was quaffing huge quantities of recreational laudanum on the daily. Go figure. Look, a man's got to have his vices. Now, I realize that opening a video about the masterpiece of one of the Western world's greatest female writers by talking up her husband is a choice. But all of this is just to say that this is the sort of person Mary Shelley was sharing her days with during the time that she was thinking about and writing Frankenstein. She was a teenage girl. Her talents were untested and unproven. She was the child of two geniuses and the partner of another. Today, those people are footnotes to her story, but at the time, she was swept up inexorably in their orbit. Shelley published two versions of the novel, one in 1818, fresh off her Percy and Claire's second tour of the continent and the famous ghost story writing competition with Lord Byron and John Polidori at Villa Diodati during that freakishly unseasonable summer of 1816, and another in 1831, the George Lucas Special Edition version, which, despite Shelley's insistence in the introduction that she, quote, introduced no new ideas or circumstances, is a radically different text in many ways. The 1818 edition is clearly the work of a not-quite 20-something tooling around Europe during their gap year. There's a lot of sightseeing and hiking. Nobody seems to have a job. There's an immense amount of respect and awe for Mother Nature. Every character has an incredible depth of feeling. It's very hormonal and very horny, which we'll get to at length. But not long after publishing the first edition, Shelley was struck by tragedy after tragedy. In 1818 and 1819, two of her children died. In 1822, Percy drowned in an idiotic and entirely avoidable boating accident. By 1831, Shelley was emotionally shattered and economically destitute. And scholars like Ann K. Meller have argued that her revisions of Frankenstein reflect the decidedly more pessimistic view of someone beaten down by life. In the 1831 edition, nature is not motherly. She's cruel and indifferent. The character of Henry Clerval, previously an unemployed libertine, is now a super entrepreneurial colonizer who can't wait to hop over to South Asia to exploit its natural resources. And Victor Frankenstein himself is not a free agent whose actions lead to destruction, but a pawn of fate in a fatalistic universe. One gets the sense that if he didn't create the monster, someone else would. Personally, I regard the 1818 edition as the far superior text, though unfortunately the 1831 edition is far more commonly read. When I talk about the book from now on, I'll be referring to the 1818 version. Shelley's pessimism, arguably even conservatism, in 1831 is a sharp contrast to her open and defiant radicalism in 1818. Strong themes of environmentalism, feminism, political and social equality, and freedom in defiance of convention pervade the earlier text. While this was not primarily due to Percy's intellectual influence, as many male scholars have traditionally argued, their bohemian lifestyle together clearly fostered her creativity. What we see in 1818 are the imaginative castles in the air that Shelley had built as a girl, the dysfunctional family dynamics she had grown up dealing with, and the libidinous atmosphere of tours in the Alps with taboo-shattering romantics converging into one of the most progressive, honest, timeless, and uniquely human novels ever written in the English language. And that might come as a surprise to those of you who aren't that familiar with the book. If anything, we tend to think of Frankenstein, largely due to the enormous cultural impact of the James Whale films, as being regressive, as being anti-science, as a conservative reaction to the Enlightenment. Meanwhile, Dracula, the other enduring Gothic masterpiece of the 19th century, is thought of as this cutting-edge, hyper-modern horror novel where turn-of-the-century technology and ingenuity triumph over ancient, superstitious, feudal evil. I would argue that this is entirely backwards. Dracula is the conservative anthem, a nationalistic fable about the danger of miscegenation with degenerate Eastern cultures. Count Dracula is a sleeper agent immigrant, a mustachioed, hook-nosed non-Aryan, diluting Anglo-Saxon blood with sexual violence. Bram Stoker, probably, a deeply repressed queer man, perfectly embodies the preoccupied repugnance that Victorians felt toward deviant sexuality. The sadomasochistic cuckoldry of Dracula's night in bed with Mina, the homoeroticism of Jonathan's imprisonment in Castle Dracula, even the subtle transgender implications of Jonathan's seduction by the brides. He very specifically mentions the hard dents of the bride's teeth pressing up against his neck. All this speaks directly to the late 19th century attitude of, "Oh, how disgusting! Tell me more so that I might learn to avoid this degeneracy." What's more, God is real in the universe of Dracula, and he's Protestant.
And remember, Catholics and Quakers worship the devil and should be killed.
Oh, remember, Lord.
Van Helsing's quartet of vampire hunters are doing the work of the Lord. Whenever a vampire is released in Stoker's novel, their faces, hideously contorted by evil, relax into expressions of heavenly peace. Staking someone is an act of Christian love. Even Dracula himself finds release in the end. Whereas in Frankenstein, God is conspicuously absent. Shelley, again a polyamorous woman raising children out of wedlock, is not bashful about sexuality. Unlike Dracula, her monster is not ontologically evil. He's benevolent until society forces him to become destructive. And Shelley's book is not anti-science, goddammit, though it might easily be misinterpreted as such by literal-minded STEM bros who think that people who are against vivisection or pesticides or tract home development are anti-science. Frankenstein is not anti-science. It's anti-hierarchy. It's anti-domination. The Christian God doesn't seem to exist in Shelley's world, but it's far from metaphysically empty. I believe that the universe of Frankenstein is governed by what scholar Bron Taylor calls dark green religion, an ideology of anti-authoritarian nature mysticism, which arose as an answer to industrial Western social and spiritual malaise. Taylor defines dark green religion as one that, quote, considers nature to be sacred, imbued with intrinsic value, and worthy of reverent care. It emphasizes the interconnectivity and dependency of all life in Earth's biome and advocates for the inclusion of non-humans, nature's proletariat, within its circle of moral concern. It rejects the supremacist anthropocentrism of both revealed religions and scientific capitalism, which insist upon the existence of an ecological hierarchy with humans at the top. Taylor's main area of study of dark green religion post-dates Charles Darwin, but he traces its origins to the early Enlightenment, namely the pantheism of Baruch Spinoza. I would add that there were some ranter, leveler, and Quaker weirdos in England who were also landing up with very similar conclusions at that same time. And crucially for us, Taylor also names Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a foundational figure of post-industrial nature mysticism. Rousseau was a towering figure in the Enlightenment and a favorite of both of Shelley's parents. Mary Wollstonecraft called him the true Prometheus of sentiment, and conversed with his ideas in Vindication of the Rights of Woman, the first written articulation of Western feminism. We know Mary Shelley was reading Rousseau at Villa Diodati during the summer of 1816. In fact, one of the main reasons Byron, Mary, Percy, Clare, and John Polidori were in Switzerland in the first place was because Geneva was Rousseau's hometown. just as it is Victor Frankenstein's. In both his fiction and non-fiction work, Rousseau argued that the, quote, sensitive soul could perceive ecstasy in the monistic harmony of nature. He reported that during walks through the same alpine landscape which figures so prominently in Frankenstein, he was overwhelmed by a sublime feeling of self-abandonment as he lost himself in the immensity of the beautiful order of Mother Gaia. His groundbreaking 1754 Discourse on Inequality, a crucial influence on Shelley, argues that social inequality is a product of society and denies the existence of a natural hierarchy, a shocking assertion at the time. Rousseau anticipates Kaczynski in his critique of industrial plenty. The accumulation of material goods has no real impact on happiness, justice, and freedom, and if anything, he argues, it's inversely proportional to those things. He presents an extended thought experiment with the character of the homme sauvage, the savage man, who is driven only by innocent self-preservation and a benevolent repugnance toward the suffering of others. But the formation of society corrupts him. Property makes him vainglorious. Hierarchy makes him unempathetic. Labor makes him miserable. Rousseau is not advocating for anarcho-primitivism. He believes that returning to a state of nature is impossible for humanity, but he does sharply question progress for progress's sake, a potent moral question in the context of the emerging Industrial Revolution, and indeed in any time of rapid technological change.
I am become meme.
It is going to bother you because you're human, and I was human. I am human, still.
In this video, I will argue that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein synthesized all these ideas into a parable about human responsibility, seen through the lens of sex, pregnancy, childbirth, and family. Forget what you know about this story, or think you know. Banish from your mind, if you can, the monochromatic expressionism of crumbling towers, hunchbacked assistants, and electrical galvanism. Imagine instead something colorful, something earthy and organic. Imagine growing things, fleshy things. Imagine the act of human creation and the desire that leads to our destruction. Unlike most other Bronze Age cosmologies, which identify a sky father and an earth mother in their pantheon of deities, ancient Egyptian mythology personified the sky as the goddess Nut, and the earth as her brother husband Geb. This may be because in other parts of the prehistoric world, rain fell from the sky impregnating the earth, which would then give birth to crops. In Egypt, life-giving water came from the annual floods of the Nile. The key ingredient in conception, therefore, came from the earth's union with itself. And what we start to see in early Egyptian texts and funerary art is a strong belief that the creative power in reproduction and regeneration belonged exclusively to the male sex. The Egyptian creation myth involves the primordial god Atum, who created both the entire universe and himself through an act of masturbation. Some of the earliest religious statuary in all of Egypt, predating even the invention of writing and the first dynastic period, depict male gods masturbating themselves into existence. Osiris, the undead green-skinned god, who, after being murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, was reassembled by his sister wife Isis, brought himself back to life by ejaculating. Isis was really only there to stimulate his excitement. And the belief that male orgasm could resurrect the dead was not metaphorical. Some ancient Egyptian armies actually made it a habit of cutting off the hands and penises of dead enemy soldiers so that they couldn't reanimate themselves. The reason this might seem so freaky and weird to us today is because for thousands of years in Western cultures, we've associated reproductive power with the female sex. Paradoxically, this has led to both the worship of females and their infantilization, a perpetual childhood, as Mary Wollstonecraft put it in Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In Western patriarchy, the womb is a sacred temple. As the only beings capable of creating life, women must be protected, read controlled, at all costs. There's a reason that so much xenophobic anxiety revolves around males from the outgroup miscegenating with females of the in-group. In this view, sex is fundamentally a predator-prey dynamic, and its expression must be tightly regulated through institutions like marriage. Female sexual desire is a horrifying aberration, if its existence is acknowledged at all. But the understanding of females as the agents of creation also has empowering aspects. Nature itself is the divine mother to us all, whose self-regulating ecosystems nurture all her children equally. Dark green religion consistently conceptualizes nature as female and humankind as male. The late 20th century radical environmentalist group Earth First rallied under the battle cry of no compromise in defense of Mother Earth, and their zines are full of references to lumber companies, ski chalets, and fur farms, quote, raping the earth. Modern nature mysticism contrasts the sexual aggression of extractive capitalism with the healthy masculinity of the environmental steward. Like a devoted husband, brother, or son, the environmentalist cooperates with nature to maintain her matriarchal balance and defends his non-human kin from other males. In Freudian terms, the environmentalist seeks reunion with Mother Nature through Rousseau's ecstatic self-abandonment, a sublime ego death as the son plunges back inside the body of his mother. In 1802, British chemist Sir Humphrey Davy published his Discourse on Chemistry, in which he argues that human mastery of that science, in agriculture, in metallurgy, in textile manufacturing, in glassblowing, was central to our success as the apex predator of this planet. The role of the modern scientist, he believes, is to, quote, interrogate nature with power, not simply as a scholar, passive and seeking only to understand her operations, but rather as a master, active with his own instruments. Tellingly, Davy genders nature as female and the scientist as male. We know Mary Shelley read Davy's discourse because she paraphrases it at length in Chapter 2 of Frankenstein, where Victor relates the circumstances of his mother's death and his first few years of study at the University of Ingolstadt. The chapter opens in 1789, when Victor is a precocious young scholar of 17. At school, he's taken under the wing of one of his professors, one Monsieur Waldman, who concludes a lecture on chemistry by declaring,
The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places.
This is the language of sexual violence. Like Atum and Osiris, the male scientist is the miracle maker, and Mother Nature is just another female to be objectified and dominated. The scientist is a misogynistic lech who desires not self-abandonment but self-gratification. His lust is the lust for power, and he wants nothing more than to re-enter his mother's womb as a conqueror. Side note, you ever notice how it's always dudes who get really worked up about humanity colonizing Mars? I don't think I've ever come across a woman who gets hot and bothered about the prospect of interstellar propulsion or colony ships or whatever. It's always the dudes who get desperate to strip Mother Earth for parts so they can spray their jizz all over the cosmos. Now, notice how Waldman throws shade at the ancient teachers and alchemists. A thematically significant but often overlooked aspect of the novel is Victor Frankenstein's boyhood fascination with occult philosophy, particularly the works of Paracelsus and Cornelius Agrippa, both of whom Mary and Percy Shelley read and were conversant with. This may not be what Shelley was getting at, but I think that 16th century alchemists like Paracelsus and Agrippa exemplified what Davy dismissively referred to as the passive observational scholar. The theology and science of their day, which were really one and the same, associated the robustness of a theory with its antiquity, and the ideas of the great Greek and Roman masters were considered unimpeachable. But Paracelsus led a medical and scientific revolution by directly observing and recording the patterns of nature. Rather than consulting a dusty old tome by Aristotle and calling it a day, he went out into the world and spoke to working people like miners and folk healers to gather empirical data. Cornelius Agrippa, meanwhile, used similar techniques to study and practice the art of magic. Today, we have strong associations with the Renaissance magician and satanic witchcraft, but this is a legacy brought down to us from the witch hunters. Agrippa saw the occult as a tool in the perfection of the corrupt human soul. Magic doesn't profane nature. It cooperates with her to bring the practitioner closer to God. Needless to say, many of Agrippa's contemporaries regarded this belief as heretical, and he spent much of his life one step ahead of the Inquisition. Waldman is correct to mock transmutation of metals and the elixir of life. Most of the material goals of the alchemists are indeed impossible. But he does a grave disservice to the great work by throwing the baby out with the aquafortis. Throughout much of its history, alchemy had what even today science lacks: a cohesive philosophical and moral doctrine which guided its practice. One of the most famous concepts in Hermeticism is the axiom, as above, so below, referring to, among other things, the harmony and connectivity which exists between the ethereal, or heavenly world, and the sublunary, or material one. Understanding the workings of nature on Earth brings us closer to understanding the will of heaven. The alchemist, like the environmentalist, ultimately seeks blissful, consensual reunion with the divine source of all life. But of course, in the novel, Victor's fascination with the alchemists is strongly discouraged by two major male role models, his father Alphonse and his other professor, Monsieur Krempe. Krempe dismisses Hermeticism as nonsense and declares that Victor has wasted his time studying, quote, exploded systems. Waldman is kinder to Paracelsus and Agrippa, referring to them as merely misdirected geniuses, but he takes the wrong lessons away from their work. The chemist should not emulate the alchemist's morality, but rather his ambition. Victor then spends the next 2 years studying natural philosophy and chemistry. He uses the highly erotic noun ardor 4 times to describe his state of mind during this period. While observing human corpses decay in crypts and charnel houses, he is struck by inspiration like a bolt of lightning, and discovers the animating principle of life. He describes this realization as a brilliant light which makes him dizzy. The discovery is so powerful it makes him see stars and practically knocks him over. After, quote, incredible labor and fatigue, he arrived, quote, at once at the summit of my desires, in the most gratifying consummation of my toils. In the stinking darkness of the tomb, with only dead bodies for company, Victor is rocked by the most orgasmic eureka in literary history. Over the next 9 months, he sets about building an 8-foot-tall being in his attic laboratory out of human and animal body parts sourced from morgues and slaughterhouses. He has no Igor or Fritz to help him. He's completely alone, and his work is entirely secret. As Victor tells this story to the polar explorer Robert Walton, he refuses to divulge the exact method by which he renewed life in dead flesh, and instead focuses only on how the process made him feel. He says this is to prevent the dark knowledge from ever being used again, but I don't believe him for a second. Clearly, Victor is not comfortable sharing the details of the reanimation because of his profound sense of sexual shame. However, it does make me think, what if we could piece together Victor's process through context clues? I sort of like the idea of Victor not using electrical galvanism, but rather some sort of jizzy alchemical fluid that he injects into the monster with like a huge honkin' old-timey syringe. If only I knew someone with an encyclopedic knowledge of Paracelsian vitalism.
Hi folks, I'm Justin Sledge from the Esoterica channel, and as you may know, I work in the academic study of magic, alchemy, Kabbalah, early science. It's a field basically known as Western esotericism, so it's the same sort of stuff that Victor Frankenstein was interested in. And I'm making a companion to this video where I look at some of the historical sources to answer just that question. How might alchemy, Kabbalah, magic, and the natural philosophy available in the early 19th century be used to make a monster? Did people of the time think that such a feat was even possible in the first place? And are there any historical known attempts to create such a being? So head over to Esoterica after you finish Andy's wonderful video here, and let's explore some historical text, let's speculate a bit based on the novel, and let's try to sort out how Frankenstein's monster could have been made.
Well, that's going to be fascinating, and y'all should definitely check out Justin's video as soon as you get through with this one. But for the purposes of our super sexy analysis, the exact scientific procedure Victor uses, whether it's electrical galvanism, some sort of quasi-occult alchemical practice, or both, is irrelevant. He tells us exactly what he's doing.
The moon gazed on my midnight labors, while, with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places.
He's raping Mother Nature. He's committing rape. Full stop. Every step in his work that he reveals to us is a profound moral transgression against the harmony of nature. He unearths the dead from their tombs, profaning their remains and interrupting the circle of life. He sources materials from the industrial slaughterhouse, that wholly unnatural dystopian death camp where individuals eugenically bred to be friendly and docile are systematically murdered. He performs vivisection, torturing animals weaker than him in his egoic pursuit of scientific advancement at any cost. And as Ann Meller points out, Victor is even reversing the course of evolution itself by reproducing asexually. Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, published early theories on natural selection that Mary Shelley was very familiar with. But nature fights back, striking Victor with mental and physical illnesses. As the scientist draws nearer toward his ultimate goal, he's beset by a nightly fever, and he grows pale and emaciated. His frantic sexual impulses go hand in hand with feelings of disgust and self-loathing. Finally, on a dreary night of November, Victor brings his creature to life by the light of a single guttering candle. By now, even the weather has turned against him. A dismal rainstorm lashes Ingolstadt like the darkness that covered Jerusalem at the crucifixion. When the creature opens his watery yellow eyes, post-nut clarity hits Victor like a freight train.
I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart.
Like a coward, Victor runs from the laboratory and throws himself onto his bed, where he faints and is tormented by horrible dreams. He awakes to see the horrific figure of the creature, pulling aside his bed curtains and reaching for him. Again, he flees, and in the morning runs into his boyhood friend Henry Clerval, in whose company he suffers a complete mental and physical breakdown. For months he languishes in illness, but nature's revenge is just beginning. When Victor finally returns home to Geneva and discovers that the creature has murdered his young brother William, he's quickly sucked into a courtroom drama, as the Frankenstein's ward, Justine Moritz, is arrested for the crime. Despite suffering, quote, living torture through what he calls a mockery of justice, Victor doesn't tell anyone. Not his grieving father Alphonse, not his cousin and paramour Elizabeth, not Justine, whose life hangs in the balance, about the existence of the creature. With the courts convinced of Justine's guilt, Victor is the only person alive who can exonerate her. But he says nothing and allows her to hang. His embarrassment about the creature's creation goes well beyond professional or reputational concerns. It instead has all the characteristics of the deep-seated shame of sexual deviancy. To tell the truth about the creature would be as unthinkable as coming out as a gay man. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, instead of having even the most basic foresight about the fact that other members of his family might be in danger, Victor mopes, feels sorry for himself, and contemplates suicide. The only sense of peace he finds within the next month is on a family hiking trip into the Alps. The awesome majesty of nature lets him forget his troubles for an all-too-brief moment, until, on a glacier in the shadow of Mount Blanc, he is at last confronted by the wretch that he has created. The creature tells Frankenstein the story of his short life. Their meeting takes place in July 1795, and the creature is not yet 2 years old. It is a tale of rejection and oppression. He is too hideous, too monstrous to be welcome in any human community, so he demands that Victor make him a companion, a woman, an Eve to his Adam. Initially moved by the creature's entreaties, Victor agrees to do it. But over the following weeks, he procrastinates. As he spends more and more time in the sublime natural landscapes around Geneva, his health returns, and his family begins to move on from their grief. But Alphonse notices a problem. Victor's late mother had always wanted him to marry Elizabeth, ever since they were young children, but Victor seems to have lost all romantic interest in her. Alphonse actually takes Victor aside and asks him, "Have your feelings changed? Do you not love her anymore?" Victor unconvincingly answers that he, quote, never saw a woman who excited him as much as Elizabeth does, but admits to us in his narration that the idea of the union fills him with horror and dismay. It's as if the creation of the creature has infected him with some sexually transmitted disease. Or perhaps, having had the experience of transgressive male reproduction, conventional sex with a woman simply can't compare. Either way, Victor flees the country to get away from his fiancée and heads to Great Britain with a handsome young male friend. Clerval, that is. After conferring with scientists in London, Victor heads up to a remote island in the Orkneys alone, where he rents a dilapidated shack and begins work on constructing a gigantic female creature. As ever, Frankenstein is vague about how exactly he does this. In Ingolstadt, he had access to city morgues, industrial slaughterhouses, and graveyards full to bursting. On this godforsaken island, which we're told is home to only 5 people, one would think that sourcing materials would be quite a bit harder. Victor incorporated the corpses of farmed animals into his first creature. Maybe, being on an island, he relied on the copious use of fish anatomy to make his second. In contrast to the, quote, enthusiastic frenzy of male lust which characterized his first conception, this time he goes about his work in, quote, cold blood. He also begins to have doubts. He begins to think, for the first time, about the repercussions of what he's doing. What if the woman he creates doesn't agree to the plan that Victor and the creature have for her? What if she turns out to be much more malevolent than her brother? What if the two creatures reproduce and outbreed humanity to become the dominant species of the planet? Anne Meller posits that the real source of Victor's hesitation is deep-rooted misogyny and resentment toward his dead mother. The reason Victor found the creation of the first creature so sexually enticing was because he had found a way to eliminate women from the process of reproduction. Victor was abandoned by his own mother, and his gut reaction at the prospect of creating a female is the terror that she will be uncontrollable. The bride's birth would also threaten Victor's profoundly homoerotic relationship with his own offspring. In Ingolstadt, Victor had experienced a delirious passion observing male corpses decay. He had selected body parts for his creation because they were, quote, beautiful, and it was only after his post-nut clarity that he realized just how horrific the full effect of the creature's visage was. And when Victor does finally break his word and destroys the body of the bride, the creature concludes his promises of revenge by saying, remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night. There are all sorts of implications to this statement. On its face, of course, it's a threat of sexual violence. The creature is a child of rape, and if his sexual urges can't be satisfied upon his aborted sister, then he will unleash them upon his father. We find out later that the creature is referring to Elizabeth, but remember, at this point in the novel, Victor thinks that the threat is directed at him. A Jungian read might frame the creature as Victor's shadow, his doppelganger. With his gigantic stature, veiny skin, and coarse hair, you could easily interpret the monster as the personification of Victor's own monstrous phallus. Victor is terrified that on their wedding night there will be no hiding his deviant, violent, insatiable sexual appetite from his pure, innocent, doting cousin Elizabeth. The subtext of Victor's latent homosexuality almost becomes text in Elizabeth's letter to him as he returns home from his disastrous misadventure in the British Isles.
Dearest Victor, answer me, I conjure you, by our mutual happiness, with the simple truth. Do you not love another? You have travelled. You have spent several years of your life at Ingolstadt, and I confess to you, my friend, that when I saw you last autumn so unhappy, flying to solitude from the society of every creature, I could not help supposing that you regret our connection, and believe yourself bound to honor the wishes of your parents, although they opposed themselves to your inclinations.
He fucked the monster! He wants to keep fucking the monster! It's so obvious! Why does no one talk about this? Elizabeth is not an idiot, and she's known Victor since he was a small child. She knows he's not attracted to her, and he doesn't exactly disabuse her of this notion. In his reply, Victor barely reassures her, and tells her that,
I have one secret, Elizabeth, a dreadful one. When revealed to you, it will chill your frame with horror. I will confide this tale of misery and terror the day after our marriage will take place.
Again, Victor procrastinates. With hindsight, we know that revealing his secret as soon as possible could save Elizabeth's life, just as it would have Justine's, but he still refuses to come clean and take responsibility for his actions. So he returns to Geneva. His wedding day arrives. He knows that the creature followed him to Scotland and back again. Victor and Elizabeth take a picturesque boat ride to a lakeside inn, which he describes as the last moments in his life when he enjoyed the feelings of happiness. Again, the only serenity to be found in Shelley's universe is when characters humbly appreciate the beauty of nature. When night falls, Victor bafflingly leaves Elizabeth in their room. Untouched, mind you, while he searches the house for the creature with pistols drawn. If Victor won't consummate his marriage, then the creature, his shadow, his monstrous phallus, will. Victor hears Elizabeth scream and bursts back into the bedroom to find her strangled dead body splayed provocatively across the bed, in an image that may have been inspired by the Fuseli painting The Nightmare. Victor's description of his terror in those moments is distinctly erotic.
My arms dropped. The motion of every fiber and muscle was suspended. I could feel the blood trickling in my veins and tingling in the extremities of my limbs. I rushed toward her and embraced her with ardor.
The first time in the novel that Victor expresses sexual attraction toward Elizabeth is after her murder. He is in love with death, and corpses are his limerent objects. For all his preening about protecting his friends and family from the creature, he's unsatisfied with the positive relationships in his life because his only authentic desires are those that lead to his own destruction. In the final chapters of Frankenstein, Victor pursues the creature across Europe and deep into the pack ice of the Arctic Sea. The creature leaves his creator taunting messages carved into stone or tree bark, beckoning him on so the two may meet in one final, mutually destructive confrontation. The creature writes that the two must, quote, wrestle for their lives, where Victor's sufferings will satisfy the creature's everlasting hatred. Victor tells us he's invigorated by these threats. It's a game of foreplay spanning continents, spurring Victor on to the copulation he desires most, that which will lead to his own orgasmic annihilation. But both Frankenstein and the monster are denied their reunion. Victor is rescued off the ice by the polar expedition of Robert Walton, to whom he relates his tale of terror and woe, and then dies of exhaustion. A hardy, hale young man in his mid-20s, cut down in his prime by inexplicable sicknesses, Mother Nature's implacable revenge against her abuser. Even on his deathbed, it's unclear that Victor has really changed or learned anything. He chides Walton's crew for wanting to turn back to England, then tells the captain to avoid ambition and instead seek happiness and tranquility. It's one final contradiction from an entitled young man with a god complex, a death wish, and a shocking lack of self-awareness rolled into one narcissistic personality. As an avatar of rapacious, unhinged male sexuality, Victor Frankenstein may be the worst father in literary history, but his real failing was that he never learned how to be a mother.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God! Oh, did you think I meant this reanimated corpse? No, I was actually talking about this video, which has been my labor of love for the past 4 months. I prefer taking my time to make the best films that I possibly can for this channel, but unfortunately, YouTube incentivizes us to shit out low-effort content as frequently as we can, because of course that makes them more money. The only reason that my crew and I can continue to make art on our own terms is due to the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Our Patreon tiers start at just $1 a month and include tons of fun benefits. Other great ways to help the channel would be to give a one-time donation via PayPal, to buy merch or memorabilia from our online store, or to sign up for a channel membership here on YouTube, which I finally figured out how to do last month after like 3 years. Don't let this whole new media thing fool you. I'm a total boomer at heart. You can find links to all that stuff down in the description or over on my website, atunshefilms.com. Ah!
Both Mary Shelley and Victor Frankenstein lost their mothers at a young age. Famously, Wollstonecraft died of postpartum infection 10 days after giving birth to Shelley, leaving William Godwin to raise both her and Fanny Imlay, Wollstonecraft's daughter from a previous relationship, as a single father. 4 years later, in 1801, Godwin married his neighbor and soon-to-be business partner Mary Jane Clairmont, whose children Charles and Claire also joined the family. Shelley loathed her stepmother and clashed with her often. Godwin's solution to this friction was to send Shelley away from home for long periods of time, most notably in 1812 to the house of William Baxter in Dundee, Scotland. Baxter was an admirer of Godwin's and had written him a fan letter, essentially, asking if there was anything he could do for the famed radical philosopher. Godwin wrote back, "Yes, you can raise my teenage daughter for me," and packed Shelley away on a boat bound for the Highlands. In a letter to Baxter, Godwin described his relationship with his daughter in a characteristically forthright way.
There can never be a perfect equality between father and child, and if he has other objects and avocations to fill up the greater part of his time, the ordinary resource is for him to proclaim his wishes and commands in a way somewhat sententious and authoritative. It can, therefore, seldom happen that he is the confidant of his child, or that the child does not feel some degree of awe or restraint in intercourse with him. I am not, therefore, a perfect judge of Mary's character.
In her time at the Baxters, Shelley experienced a more functional family dynamic than her own. Coupled with her complicated reverence toward her emotionally distant father, it's hard not to draw a connection between the 14-year-old Shelley's abandonment issues and sense of isolation within the close-knit Baxter household, and the many months the creature spends in the hovel adjoining the de Lacy cottage, peering in at a loving family that he could never truly be a part of. Like many women at that time, Shelley started a family of her own when she was still just a girl. Percy impregnated her during their escape to the continent in the whirlwind summer of 1814, and she soon got to experience the roiling body horror of a pubescent pregnancy. It was a particularly painful gestation, made worse by Shelley's constant anxiety that she would share the fate of her unfortunate mother. Her fears proved misplaced. Back in England, Shelley prematurely gave birth to an infant daughter in late February 1815. The next day, Percy wrote in his journal, "Mary quite well. The child unexpectedly alive, but still not expected to live." Shelley scarcely had time to recover from her delivery before the young family moved house across London. They were in their new home less than a week when, on the morning of March 6th, she awoke to find her baby dead. Shelley guessed by the child's appearance that she had died of, quote, convulsions. A pall of grief settled over the household. The Shelleys tried to distract themselves with visits from friends, games of chess, reading history books, and following the news of Napoleon Bonaparte's return from exile and march to Paris. But Mary's misery was inescapable. As she wrote in her diary on March 13th,
"Stay at home, Ned, and think of my little dead baby. This is foolish, I suppose. Yet whenever I am left alone to my own thoughts, and do not read to divert them, they always come back to the same point, that I was a mother, and am so no longer."
Over the following week, she began to have recurring dreams about the dead child, writing this on Sunday the 19th.
"Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits."
This absolutely chilling entry is much more than just an expression of grief. It's an early indication of feelings Shelley expressed frequently in her writings and in Frankenstein, feelings which were unutterably taboo even in the progressive milieu of the Romantics. Postpartum trauma and revulsion. As feminist scholar Ellen Moores puts it, fear, guilt, depression, and anxiety are common reactions for mothers following the birth of babies. But in Western culture, women are not permitted to experience these feelings. Instead, the creation of life must always be a joyful cause of celebration, and the mother must be overcome with happiness and nurturing love, or fucking else. But the creation of life is, at face value, an absolutely gruesome physical experience. The violence of childbirth itself, even when everything goes smoothly, is a significant source of PTSD for many mothers. Even today, 9 to 50% of mothers report that their birthing experience was traumatic. But very few healthcare providers actually screen for PTSD as part of postnatal care. And what comes next is even more terrifying, as a misshapen, blood-soaked, barely human imp ogles up at you, squalling for attention and nourishment, and it sinks in that not only are you responsible for this little freak, but that your relationship with them will probably define the rest of your natural life. There are so many unknowns in that moment, so many disquieting questions. What if I don't love my child like I'm supposed to? What if I inflict my trauma and neurosis onto them? What if they turn out to be deformed or grow up to be an asshole? What if, God forbid, I can't take care of them and they die? When Victor Frankenstein gives birth, he's so repulsed by the ugly visage of his creation that he flees the laboratory and flings himself onto his bed, #relatable, where he falls unconscious and is tormented by a shocking Freudian nightmare. He dreams that he sees Elizabeth walking the streets of Ingolstadt. But no sooner has he kissed her that her lips begin peeling off her teeth, and the rot of the grave spreads across her face. Not only that, but her features transform into those of Victor's dead mother, a stinking skeleton wrapped in a burial shroud, being devoured by furiously masticating worms. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see in Victor's dream Shelley's own profound ambivalence toward her own long-dead mother, as well as her consistent association in this period of the womb with the tomb,
mirror images at the axis mundi of the female Gothic. So Victor starts awake, sweating and shivering, classic symptoms of postpartum fever, when, by the sickly yellow light of the moon, he sees the creature pulling aside his bed curtains, reaching out to him, smiling, babbling inarticulately. Baby talk. And Victor, feeling what so many new mothers do but could never admit to, is utterly terrified. He flees again, hoping irrationally that the creature will stop existing if he simply ignores it. And though Victor is too cowardly to do the deed himself, like 41% of depressed new mothers, he is clearly experiencing filicidal ideation. In pre-industrial Europe, there was a common folk belief that fairies, trolls, devils, or some other supernatural creature would kidnap newborn babies and replace them with deformed changelings. Parents would then need to leave this changeling exposed outdoors for a certain period of time, so the fae folk or whoever else would take away the imposter. In practice, this was culturally sanctioned infanticide, especially of the disabled, a polite outlet for the inconveniently common feelings of revulsion toward their offspring, which many mothers experience. Thankfully, infanticide is an extreme outcome of postpartum trauma. Sometimes, as in Victor's case, their revulsion can manifest into a parent's resentment for their child and a long-term lack of adequate maternal care. But most often, mothers don't act on these feelings at all. They just go through the motions of what's expected of them, in the hope that with time they'll fall powerfully in love with their child in the way that everybody says they're supposed to. Frankenstein is profoundly concerned with, as Anne Meller puts it, natural and unnatural modes of reproduction. What could be more of a satanic inversion of the maternal ideal than a woman whose abuser is her own baby? Studies significantly associate postpartum trauma with an inability to breastfeed and poor nutrition outcomes for the child. It's not hard to imagine how women going through this might experience intense feelings of guilt about their failings as a parent. A mother who can't care for their own child. What could be more of a violation of dark green religion? As a mother herself, what could outrage nature more? After the death of her first child, Shelley became pregnant again almost immediately. She would be with child almost continuously for the next 4 years. And as an unmarried mother, patriarchal society regarded her as something of a monster herself. We have no real way of assessing Shelley's psychological state during this time, though between diary entries and context clues, it seems very likely that she dealt with postpartum trauma. In January 1816, Shelley gave birth to a healthy boy who she called William, after her father. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed, he was the spitting image of Percy. Ironically, it was around this time that the Shelleys' relationship with Godwin was the most strained. He and Percy were constantly squabbling about money, and when Mary came to visit her half-sister Fanny at their childhood home, Godwin wouldn't even let her inside. As with her first child, there are echoes of William in Shelley's fiction. Somewhat morbidly, she names Victor Frankenstein's doomed youngest brother, William, and describes him as having blonde hair and blue eyes. When the creature comes to Geneva after his years with the cottagers, he encounters William playing in the fields outside town and tries to kidnap him, reasoning that as the child is too young to have developed prejudices, he might be able to keep him as a companion. But William struggles, calls the creature an ogre, and reveals that his name is Frankenstein. Enraged, the creature handles the boy roughly and accidentally kills him. There's a lot going on here. At this point in the novel, Shelley, and us the audience, firmly identify with the creature, who is returning from a childhood spent in exile, much like Shelley did in Scotland. The creature kills a person named William, who he blames for that exile, and in that sense, this is a patricidal fantasy. As William lays dead at his feet, the creature notices a pendant on his breast containing a portrait of Caroline, Victor and William's late mother. The creature immediately feels intense sexual attraction to this image. The whole episode is a writhing mass of Freudian impulses. But it's also, of course, a filicidal fantasy. If we identify Shelley with the creature, we might infer a deep-seated anxiety that she must murder her own children before they murder her, just as she did her own mother. However, if we identify the creature with Shelley's dead first daughter, who she dreamed she resurrected before the fire, then the implication is even more disturbing. Is this scene a subconscious reflection of Shelley's guilt for her initial failure as a mother? Guilt so powerful that it might cause her dead infant daughter to rise from the grave and take revenge on the happy, healthy baby boy who had replaced her? As Mary dealt with the tribulations of her second postpartum period, the rest of her odd little family were dealing with troubles of their own.
Claire Claremont had, by this time, fixated on the idea of seducing Lord Byron. The two had hooked up in London sometime that winter, but mounting scandals and mounting debts forced the infamous libertine to flee the country in April and make for Switzerland. Consumed with limerence, Claire began pressuring Mary and Percy into taking another tour of the continent so she could follow him. Percy was amenable to the idea. He had just published his passion project, the epic poem Alastor, or The Spirit of Solitude, to scathing reviews from critics, and with characteristic melodrama was now demanding to, quote, resort to the most distant and solitary regions. The Shelleys, William and Claire, departed for Switzerland in early May 1816, on the cusp of the most uncanny summer in modern history. Mount Tambora had erupted in Indonesia the previous spring, causing explosions which were heard thousands of miles away and spewing a column of smoke more than 25 miles high into the atmosphere. The effects were apocalyptic for local residents and wildlife. Over the following months, volcanic ash, sulfur oxide, and other particles and gases spread across the entire planet, lowering global temperatures, fueling unseasonable storms, and causing freakish atmospheric anomalies. It was in these wet, ungenial conditions when the Shelleys, Claire, Byron, and Polidori converged on Villa Diodati, the most iconic gathering of spooky vegetarian sexpots in history. And I'll tell you, I've been to a few. As the young bohemians indulged in conversation, copulation, and substance abuse in the palatial villa, they were plagued by rainy days, fulgurant nights, and tephra-tinged sunsets with deep yellows, oranges, reds, pinks, and purples. No one in Europe yet knew the true cause of the summer's wretched unseasonableness. Even though the eruption of Tambora was a natural event, it coincided with the first major carbon spike of the Anthropocene. Within Shelley's lifetime, humans had become geological forces, and climate change as we know it had begun. For an early 19th century Brit living through the throes of these changes, especially one with a belief in dark green mysticism, it must have seemed as though Mother Nature herself was imparting a punishing lesson on her most hideous progeny. As Shelley related years later in her 1831 introduction to the novel, one night, after listening to Percy and Byron discuss advancements in modern science and mulling over what her contribution would be to their ghost story competition, she laid down to sleep and was assailed by a waking nightmare. Once again, dreams gave shape to Shelley's darkest maternal fears and desires. She writes,
I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing, which had received such imperfect animation, would subside into dead matter. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes.
Even in the surreal logic of this reverie, there is a clear shift in perspective. Shelley starts by looking at Victor kneeling on the floor of the room, but when he flees for the safety of his bed, Shelley becomes Victor. No longer is he safely externalized as a separate character. As Meller says, only from inside the student's drawn bed curtains could Shelley see those yellow, watery eyes. Yellow eyes, by the way, which match the dim and yellow light of the moon, described during the reanimation scene in the novel, and very likely the same sickly color of moonlight filtered through sulfurous air which streamed into Shelley's room at Villa Diodati. Perhaps that particular hue also reminded her of the flickering firelight which warmed her dead baby back to life. And as she describes Victor's hope that the creature's spark of vitality would fade, perhaps Shelley is articulating the most unspeakable emotion a mother who loses her child could possibly feel. Relief. Earlier this year, I got a vasectomy. When the surgeon came in, he asked if he could put on some music. I said, sure. He put on WWOZ, the local jazz station. Then he picked up a knife and sliced into my testicles.
Sticking a brain, okay. I'll take a credit.
When people ask me why I got snipped, I generally kind of gesture vaguely to fascism and climate change, and people go, oh yeah, totally understandable. But the truth is that whenever my friends and family members get pregnant, and I'm in my early 30s, so that's happening a lot these days, I get a horrible weight in the pit of my stomach. Oftentimes I'm genuinely happy for them. You know, sometimes I can even look them in the eye and say, you'll be a really great father, and mean it. But there's another part of me that can't shake the idea that in 9 months, another American will come into the world, another ravening cannibal who will spend the next better part of a century burning fossil fuels, housing cheeseburgers, and ignoring homeless people at traffic lights. Billionaires are by far the worst climate criminals, but according to Oxfam, the richest 10% of humans globally also share a considerable amount of blame for CO2 emissions from consumption. And that richest 10% includes just about everybody who lives in the global north above the poverty line. The role of population growth on climate catastrophe has historically been way overstated, but there's no question that this is a crisis inflicted by the haves onto the have-nots. And every single person born in the global north exacerbates the problem by virtue of the huge amount of resources that they are almost certainly bound to consume. And you can say, you know, oh, well, I'll bring up my kid to share my values and they won't do those things. And I can respect that, but that's a hell of a gamble, right? I mean, you know, you could take your kid to school every day on your bike, but if every other parent has an SUV, eventually your kid's going to get curious and want to drive a car, right? And then what are you going to do? You know, forbid them? I mean, they're just going to do it anyway. I just don't think there's any realistic way that anybody in the global north could have a child that won't eventually cause massive harm to the planet. And probably, like most people, not even realize that they're doing it. And that's all assuming that your kid grows up to be a kind person, which is also a hell of a gamble. A lot of bullies and dumbasses walking around out there in the world. A lot of rapists, too. What if my pride and joy grows up to be somebody else's abuser? If I give birth to a baby daughter, then there's a 1 in 4 chance that she's going to be raped. I don't like those odds. But the real kicker is that even if my child has a great life, even if they cause no harm to others, they will still suffer. They will still die. It is unavoidable. Right? I will be inflicting this fate upon them without their knowledge or consent, only to spring it on them when their pet goldfish dies or whatever. You know, surprise, bitch! The wages of sin is death! To me, the creation of human life is very obviously an incredibly selfish thing to do under most circumstances. And I'm not saying that we should like make it illegal to have children or whatever, but I am saying that this is a deeply consequential thing to do, and maybe we should give it a little bit more thought than just, oh, well, that's just what people do at this age, or I want someone to take care of me when I'm old, or I just want the family name to live on, as though that were anything other than vanity. On the cover page of the first edition of Frankenstein, there's a quote from John Milton, Paradise Lost. It's Adam talking to God, and he says, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Well, with all due respect to John Milton, I think enraged children all over the world put it much more succinctly when they snap at their parents that righteous and unanswerable declaration, "I didn't ask to be born." Like most of us, Frankenstein's monster has no memory of his birth. Instead, as he later reveals to his cursed creator around a fire pit chiseled into a dramatic alpine cave, He remembers only alternating sensations of light and of darkness, calling to mind the opening lines of Genesis. He wanders out of Victor's apartment and in the dead of night somehow finds his way out of Ingolstadt. Oppressed by the heat of the rising sun, he takes refuge in the forest surrounding the city. One has to wonder if the guards at the city walls were asleep on duty. An 8-foot-tall reanimated corpse blundering out of the gates seems hard to miss, even at 4 in the morning. But once the creature has reached the safety of the woods, Shelley can fangirl over Rousseau to her heart's content, and the monster immediately becomes an avatar of the homme sauvage. Driven by base sensation, but ultimately benevolent and innocent, the creature finds in the forest the only community he will ever know. Trees, herbs, birds, insects, beyond human kinfolk. He tries to communicate with these life forms, instinctively recognizing his connectivity to them. Even his eating habits are in equilibrium with the life around him. The idea of hunting animals doesn't even occur to this man, savage though he may be, and he subsists instead on nuts and berries. Like Victor, the creature's only solace in life is in the ecstasy of dark green grandeur. But crucially, Mother Nature doesn't punish the creature as she does Victor. Instead, she unreservedly accepts him as one of her children. As in the story of Prometheus, once the creature discovers fire, everything starts to go wrong. One day he comes across a still burning campfire left by some itinerant beggars, and gradually works out how to keep it burning. He gorges himself on the, quote, offals of the beggar's meal, thereby learning that food can be cooked. Though Shelley likely meant offals in the archaic sense, that is, as a catch-all word for leftovers or garbage, if she did intend the meal to be animal intestines, then this would be the only time in the creature's early life that he eats meat. This deviation from what the Shelleys called the, quote, natural diet of vegetarianism is another indication that the creature's education is steadily corrupting him, alienating him from a state of dark green grace. Continuing his speed run of human history, the creature is forced by the plummeting temperatures of late autumn to seek shelter. He comes across a shepherd's hut, symbolically significant due to its associations with ancient and classical pastoralism. Here he finds an old man, possibly the shepherd himself, who flees in terror at the sight of him. The creature doesn't yet fully understand how different he is from other hominids, so the old man's flight confuses him more than anything else. He eats the old man's breakfast of bread and cheese, but has no taste for his wine, a detail that must have pleased the teetotaler Percy very much. And again, a beverage which has strong associations with agricultural civilization and a loss of Edenic innocence. The next day, the creature leaves the hut and the forest, crossing tilled fields for several hours before arriving at a populous farming village. Astounded by the abundance of food in the gardens and pantries of the cottages, his nose leads him into one home where he is immediately attacked by the horrified inhabitants. The monster barely escapes the village with his life and realizes that a pattern is clearly emerging. His first encounter with an organized human community teaches him a very basic understanding of tribalism, of the self and the other. The formation of society, Shelley seems to say, is predicated on this fundamental dichotomy. But the creature still needs shelter and food. At length, his travels take him to an isolated cottage in the woods, which backs up to a small hovel and a pigsty. He snatches some bread from the cottage and some water from the stream running by it, then makes himself quite at home in the hovel, thinking of nothing but sustenance and escape from, quote, the barbarity of man. But it's here that the creature learns, all too tragically, what it is to be truly human. Looking through a tiny chink in the wall of the cottage, he observes the family who lives there, the de Lacys, a blind elderly father and his 2 grown children, Felix and Agatha. Tellingly, the family lacks a mother. At first he's merely curious, the kind of passive scientific observer Waldman so detests. He tries to make sense of the de Lacys' habits and relationships. He slowly begins to imitate their method of communication, that is, the French language, and he is profoundly moved by their artistic expressions and displays of deeply felt emotion. But as he remains in the hovel for several months, he develops an intense parasocial attachment to the de Lacys. Sustenance and shelter are no longer enough for the creature. He must now have love and fellowship. He must have that which Victor so selfishly denied him: a family. By contrasting the de Lacys' attractive physical appearances with his own reflection in water, the creature steadily comes to realize why humans find him so abhorrent. He endeavors, therefore, to try to become as much like them as possible. the family that he calls, quote, superior beings, and begins to devise ways to ingratiate himself among them. The de Lacys have unwittingly introduced the creature to the concept of hierarchy, especially after he hears the family reading a history book aloud, which impresses on him that, quote, the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent, united with riches. A wave of self-hatred accompanies these realizations, entrenching in the creature's not-quite-human mind that the pigsty truly is his place. While these chapters are doubtlessly informed by Shelley's own sense of isolation as a motherless child, the creature's education also has salient political dimensions, most obviously in regard to marginalized identity. Feminist scholars like Carol J. Adams have argued that the creature's experience as the excluded other mirrors the feminine experience of constantly looking in on the inner circle of patriarchal society, but being forever forbidden from partaking in it. Like the creature, women aren't biologically determined to be second-class citizens. Society and culture inflict that fate upon them. Young girls don't come out of the womb knowing that they can't leave a drink unattended when they're out at a bar, or that they shouldn't go to the 24-hour gym after a certain time of night. They have to be told these things by an authority figure, or learn them from bitter experience. Even the creature's hideousness is a culturally determined trait. If Victor's worst nightmare ended up coming true and the creature and his bride populated the earth with a new race of monsters, then obviously beauty standards would change. The creature is only abhorrent because of arbitrary human prejudices of the unique other. Whether by cottagers or Instagram models, we all need to be taught that we're ugly. The creature's shocking physical appearance also has distinctly racialized connotations. Shelley describes his skin as yellow, as we've seen, a color associated in the text with perversion and the uncanny. His hair is long and black, like an East Asian or Native American man's might be, and he's gigantic and freakishly strong, calling to mind anti-black stereotypes of the bestial African male. But of course, we're in the creature's head at this point in the novel. He has our sympathy. Despite his appearance and his strange origins, we know that he's an intelligent, thoughtful, and sensitive being. Shelley is demonstrating that the cognitive dissonance between what society tells us to think and what we know to be true is the axis of oppression. Political philosopher Alan Coffey has made a fascinating comparison between these chapters of Frankenstein and the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery without a name or a family. Initially, Douglass, who was probably the child of his enslaver, had a happy boyhood of ignorant bliss, but around the age of 7 he was confronted by the brutal reality of his lot in life. The more knowledge he gained about the world and his place in it, the more his sorrow and outrage increased, building to a breaking point of drastic revolutionary action. Many people of color must learn to speak white to be accepted in mainstream Western society, and sure enough, during his months in the hovel, the creature assiduously teaches himself French, delusionally preparing for the day when he will be able to reveal himself to the de Lacys and seamlessly integrate among them. Later, Victor mentions to Walton that the creature was surprisingly eloquent, another subtle indicator of racial prejudice. The slave ships stripped Douglass's ancestors of their identities, much like Victor did the individual identities of the beings whose body parts now collectively constitute the creature. And those without an identity will stop at nothing to acquire one. Once the creature learns to speak, and improbably to read and write, perhaps, as Leslie Klinger suggests, the creature's brain once belonged to a French-speaking person, and these things were not so much learned as remembered, he soon gets his hands on a few books that someone left in the woods nearby. The most penetrating is, naturally, Paradise Lost, which the creature initially believes is a work of nonfiction. He identifies both with Satan as a revolutionary against unjust hierarchy, and with Adam as a being whose existence was forced upon him by an aloof and selfish creator, a common enough interpretation among the Romantics. Milton hammers home just how alone the creature is in his plight. Unlike him, Adam actually has a relationship with his father. Even Satan has demons for fellowship. The story gives the creature a full-blown existential crisis. Who am I? He asks himself. Where did I come from? What is my purpose? Unlike most of us, the creature soon discovers an answer to those questions from lab notes, secreted in the clothes that he's been wearing since the night of his birth, which he initially paid no mind to, but are now able to read. From these, the creature learns definitively that he is not human, and that he was created by a Genovese man named Victor Frankenstein. He is a new species of mammal. Remember, Victor got his materials from the morgue and the slaughterhouse. He may be as much pig as he is primate, and in that sense, our vegetarian author seems to be suggesting that the creature is not only the victim of cultural marginalization, but of speciesism and human supremacy. The creature recognizes non-human animals as fellow sensitive beings. One of his earliest impulses is to try and speak with them, and when he implores Victor to make him a mate, he proposes to take her to South America where, quote, the beasts of the field will be their companions. And of course, during his time at the de Lacy cottage, he literally lives in the pigsty alongside the family cow. Like him, domesticated animals are artificial, created not by nature but by man for his own self-serving ends. In early industrial Britain, and even more so today, farmers negligently bring intelligent animals like cows and pigs into existence on a whim and subject them to hellish lives of suffering and exploitation. In 2025, the French Bulldog was the most popular dog breed in America. Even these animals, who we purport to love, are the products of sick eugenic experiments, the results of which sacrifice their quality of life in exchange for their marketability as a commodity. But in terms of sheer malevolent audacity, Victor Frankenstein has nothing on the good people of JBS and Tyson Foods, who breed and slaughter birds by the tens of billions every year in factory farms. Broiler chickens are genetically modified to reach a slaughter weight of 4.8 pounds within their first 35 days of life. That's the equivalent of a human baby growing to the size of an adult tiger in just 2 months. It's not without good reason that many animal rights groups refer to these birds as Frankenchickens. The creature is, in many ways, a thought experiment about what it would be like if a domesticated animal could talk. I think they'd say something along the lines of, "How dare you sport thus with life?" Don't you? So this person, without a name, without a home, without an identity, without even a species, remains in this hovel, this literal limbo between the world of the animal and the world of the human for more than a year. He's effectively still an infant, and the de Lacy family is the absolute center of his world. At last, he makes a move to introduce himself to them, waiting until Agatha, Felix, and his girlfriend Safi are out on a walk before entering the cottage to speak with their blind old father. It's going well at first, but then the kids come home early, and the second that Felix lays eyes on the creature, he tragically attacks him and throws him out of the house. Heartbroken, the creature considers killing the de Lacys in revenge for their rejection, but after some time, he calms down and returns to the cottage, determined to try again. He's too late. The family has hurriedly moved out of what must seem to them to be a house haunted by some horrible demon. Our anguished, wretched creature realizes that there was never, ever any way in hell that he could have been taken in by the de Lacys, and he burns their house down in his grief. His thoughts then turn to Victor Frankenstein, his unfeeling, heartless creator who endowed the capacity to desire and to suffer onto an object that could inspire only revulsion and horror. Burning with hatred, he travels to Geneva. Just outside town, he encounters and inadvertently kills little William Frankenstein, then frames Justine Moritz for the murder. The creature has committed his first act of violence. Victor and William's father, Alphonse, is a syndic, and indeed, the Frankensteins come from a long line of politicians and counselors within the Republic of Geneva. That makes Victor a privileged and powerful player within bourgeois society. And if we understand the creature's birth, and the rape of Mother Nature which facilitated it, as a form of institutional violence, then the creature's revenge becomes nothing less than a form of revolution. When we see these events from Victor's point of view earlier in the novel, he barely even thinks about the creature after he's abandoned him. And when William is found murdered, it seems like this shocking and unexpected act. But when the creature shares his side of the story, Shelley very explicitly situates it as a direct result of Victor's negligence and the creature's oppression at the hands of humanity. As he tells us himself,
"I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. Thanks to the lessons of Felix and the sanguinary lords of man, I have learned how to work mischief. Everywhere I see bliss from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear.
For Victor, the privileged beneficiary of systemic oppression, institutional violence is something that happens distantly, far from polite society, to members of an outgroup whose lives are quietly understood to be of little value. So when members of the outgroup strike back, even in ways that are objectively quite horrible, the level of vilification they receive is laughably disproportionate. As an abolitionist who boycotted slave-made sugar, Shelley may well have been drawing from European reactions to the Haitian Revolution, or perhaps Bussa's rebellion in 1816, when thousands of slaves revolted against the British Empire on the island of Barbados. Earlier in the novel, she tells us that the creature wept when he learned of the fate of America's indigenous people from Felix's history book. Even today, common narrativizations of American history portray acts of anti-colonial violence as largely unprovoked, ignoring the decades or centuries of institutional violence which preceded them. And William's murder arguably forces Victor's hand. Once the creature reaches Geneva, he finally comes face to face with his creator during their mountaintop confrontation, where he demands that Victor make him a female mate. Not only is Victor genuinely persuaded by the creature's arguments, he knows there will be serious and deadly consequences if he refuses. And the creature is really not asking for all that much. His threats of violence aren't malicious, they're strategic. He simply wants to be left alone, to live out his #van life, Walden Pond homesteading fantasy of dark green equilibrium.
If you consent, neither you nor any other human being shall ever see us again. I will go to the vast wilds of South America. My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. My companion will be of the same nature as myself, and will be content with the same fare. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human, and you must feel that you could deny it only in the wantonness of power and cruelty.
You sure you don't want to go to Brooklyn, my man? The vegan options are fantastic. Victor agrees to make the monster a companion, but as we've seen, in Scotland he changes his mind and destroys the unfinished bride before the creature's very eyes. With that, the monster resolves to become the demon that everyone believes him to be. From Scotland to Ireland and back to Geneva, he follows Victor around Europe, leaving a trail of corpses in his wake. First Clerval, then Elizabeth, then Alphonse, who dies under the weight of all his grief. As Victor weeps over the graves of his loved ones, the creature mocks his misery. When justice is unattainable, only bitterness and vengeance remains. The most tragic thing a revolutionary can do is lose hope. Locked in a passionate Freudian death feud with his creator, the creature leads the chase into the Arctic, to a physical and emotional landscape too inhospitable even for Mother Nature. The creature travels by dog sled and hunts animals for food. Brute force now defines his moral universe. But somewhere close to the North Pole, he realizes Victor is no longer pursuing him. Turning back, he happens upon the brig of Robert Walton, and in the novel's final scene, the explorer enters Victor's cabin to find the monster hunched over his dead body, weeping. As Walton execrates him, quite unfairly in my opinion, the creature reveals that he never truly abandoned his humanity after all.
Think you that the groans of Clerval were music to my ears? My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture such as you cannot even imagine. You hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that with which I regard myself.
So in the creature's tragedy, Shelley offers us a spark of hope. Frankenstein's monster, like all of Mother Nature's children, is inherently good. His father's misery and death offers him no consolation. In fact, it's robbed him of the only family he ever really had. An irresponsible father is still a father. In the end, Victor failed as a parent and as a scientist. A good scientist would be able to tell from careful observation that living beings are not just an automated collection of parts, any more than a son is an extension of his father. The creature is his own man, his own mind, his own soul. Victor's mistake was not the pursuit of knowledge. It was the abdication of responsibility. The creature tells Walton that he's the last human being he will ever lay eyes on. He promises to cause no more harm. He will instead go to the northern extremity of the globe, as far as he possibly can from any other living thing, and set himself on fire. He leaps from the window onto an ice raft, and we're told that he is borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. In Shelley's original handwritten manuscript, Walton says that he, quote, lost sight of him in the darkness and distance, implying that the creature isn't gone, he's just hidden, that he might still be out there somewhere. That, like the consequences of our actions, he will never truly leave us.